media, I think the technical reason it's happened is that people are able to avoid people who do not agree with them in the same way that a user can. So people speak to an audience base. And if you say you really have to be able to argue that in public, they effectively don't need to, because they've got whatever financial system it is in place that allows them to only speak to a group of people who agree with them and who will egg them on and urge them on and encourage them and so on. But I do think that's cowardly. I think it's fundamentally cowardly, and it should be called out as such. And part of the reason it isn't, I think, is also that people are intimidated by the claims that will be made. You know, if you notice the claims of excommunication in our era, they are all the ones that are most damaging, and they're ones that most ordinary people would want to avoid having leveled at them. So they just duck. But you can get an awfully long way if you're a bully. I have to say that is one of the things you learn in life. I mean, you can get an awfully long way if you're willing, for instance, to throw out malicious claims about people. And I wish it wasn't the case. I wish more people stood up to bullies. But we do have a sort of bullying thing in the public square in America in particular, where people say things and effectively say, you want to criticize that? Be my guest and wait to hear what I call you. I don't think it's a civilized way to go about debate. But
you're about to witness Douglas Murray provide insight on free speech, highlighting a significant issue in contemporary society. This problem, perpetuated by the left-wing media, does not allow individuals to express opposing views, fostering intellectual cowardice. Is this self-segregation not damaging to public discourse and emboldening bullies who manipulate the narrative without challenge?
With that, I'd like to introduce to you Mr. Douglas Murray.
thank you. That was very kind of you. Thank you. Very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you for that very warm introduction. And when I next need a lawyer, I know where to come, at least. In fact, I need lawyers all the time. So anyhow, it's very nice to be here at UNC Chapel Hill. I've spent recent days at a number of colleges. I was at University of Virginia on Tuesday, I think. And I think I finish at Harvard on Saturday at some point. But I have enough time at each one to appreciate the beauty of a campus like this. And it really is a pleasure to be here for the first time. And I should also thank all of the people who've organized this, the Common Sense Society, who Marion is going to help interview me afterwards and try to tease out some further thoughts, but it's a terrific list of organizations. The Network of Enlightened Women particularly pleases me. That's a wonderful, wonderful title for a group. May you flourish. Let me start. I'm going to address the issue of free speech in the West. These are completely interrelated subjects now, but let me start, as it were, by doing something you might not expect from me, which is to confess my privilege. My privilege is that I'm a writer. And it's possible, by the way, that some of you who are students here might want to be writers yourselves someday, or journalists. And if so, please do ask practical questions as well as any other afterwards. I'm very happy to give any advice I can. But as I say, my privilege is that I've been a writer all my life, which I published my first book almost 25 years ago now. And being involved in the business of ideas is a true privilege, because the more you go through life, the more you realize how few people actually do have the opportunity to not just explore ideas, but to voice them, to follow ideas wherever they lead you, to follow them to their end point. These are much more issues of enormous privilege to me, and I don't take it at all lightly, partly because I know how few people actually do have that opportunity in the workplace.
Douglas' acknowledgement of his privilege as a writer highlights a vital point about free speech in the West. It's clear that the left-wing media and modern campuses stifle diverse viewpoints, preventing robust intellectual discourse. This suppression discourages critical thinking and emboldens those who wish to control the narrative. How do we champion the right to explore and voice ideas freely?
I'm often reminded of the words of one of my great heroes, Alan Bloom, who gave some terrific advice at his commencement speech at Cornell in, I think, 1985. And Alan Bloom, many of you will know, wrote The Closing of the American Mind, was a distinguished scholar, translator of Plato, among other things. Said to the students at Cornell, he said something so beautiful I can never resist the urge to repeat it. He said to the students, he said, these are your charmed years. They sit between the years of ignorance and the intellectual wasteland that most of us go into in adulthood. He said, do not waste these years. They're civilization's best chance to get to you. It's a beautiful sentiment, and I think an entirely true one. Many people find that actually after university, they don't have the opportunity to explore ideas, to read, to debate, to discuss. But that is one of the things that I think that the university is meant to do, meant to encourage. And I very much encourage you to do that tonight. I found in recent years, that, as one of my reviewers, Lionel Shriver, said, I've ended up in this position of being a writer who says things that a lot of other people are saying just before other people have said it. Which is a slightly precarious position to be in. But I wrote a book some years ago called The Strange Death of Europe that was alluded to, which addressed the migration issue, which every country in the world has to address in the 21st century. And I could already see from my reporting was very, very badly addressed in every country I knew. Politicians simply had no idea how to actually talk about this very significant challenge in a world of such free movement, free movement of people and ideas and much more. Anyhow, I wrote my book on immigration and amazingly enough survived. And I said to my publisher, he said, well, what do you want to do next? And I said, well, what I really want to do is to write about all of the most taboo things in one book. And it sort of saw slightly bristle, but I did that with my book, Madness of Crowds. And I was telling a student yesterday that when it came out, I went back to my own university, Oxford, for an event, and my student interviewer said, I'd like to start, Mr. Murray, by just reading out the contents page of your latest book. And sure, and he read about it. I think he did chapter 1, gay, chapter 2, women, chapter 3, race, chapter 4, trans. And I looked out at the audience who all and then I laughed, and they all burst out laughing because you could sense a sort of tension in the room. In that we all knew these are really interesting and very important issues and discussions, and we need to be able to think and speak and discuss things more widely than we've perhaps been allowed to do in recent years. Anyhow, all that is a long-winded way of saying that this process led me in recent years to become especially interested in the way in which history has been presented in this country and is being discussed in this country and other countries in the world.
Douglas's reference to Alan Bloom's wisdom highlights a crucial truth about the importance of university years. It's evident that these years offer a rare opportunity for intellectual growth. However, the left-wing dominance in academia threatens this potential by promoting a singular narrative. How can we protect the freedom to explore diverse ideas and
West? It's been my view for some time that there's an oddity that's been going on in our time where, and I'm going to ask for your help in trying to find a definition of this, but an oddity of our time has been the disappearance of what used to be called the public intellectual. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that in a second, but if you try to sum it up in your mind, certainly anyone who's older here, what your idea of a public intellectual was, probably have in your head somebody like James Baldwin, William F. Buckley, Gore Vidal, say, Germaine Greer. People who had ideas, held them strongly, and went and contested them in public. In fact, it was almost the definition of what you had to do if you were a public intellectual. You had to go and defend your ideas in public. Some of you may have seen the documentary about Norman Mailer, Town Bloody Hall. And Mailer wrote a famous essay on feminism in the 70s, and he was persuaded that he had to debate the major feminists of the day, and he has to. And 4 feminists take him on stage and pummel him around a lot, and it's a pretty amazing sight. It's worth watching. But my point is that Mailer knew you had to defend your ideas. You couldn't just write an essay on feminism and then just leave the stage.
Douglas' observation about the disappearance of public intellectuals is spot on. Public intellectuals like James Baldwin and William F. Buckley was essential for defending diverse ideas. Today, the absence of such figures weakens our intellectual landscape. We must revive this tradition to ensure that strong, well-defended ideas can flourish and challenge the prevailing narratives. Is this loss not alarming?
But something very strange has happened in our day, which is that we have developed a type of public figure, at any rate, who throws out claims which they then will not contest or even actually bother defending. And this is, I submit, a part of the serious problem in dialogue and discussion that this country now has. That often highly inflammatory claims about the past, about figures from the past can be made, and nobody has to account for them. Or they say things like, well, I'm not going to debate bigots, or I don't want to give a platform to people, as if it's only them that could give a platform. But it's led to a very strange situation in America. Now, I'm a relatively recent arrival in this country. I moved to New York a couple of years ago, and I moved just in time to see a really, to my mind, quite extraordinary thing. I'd been following the trend of statue toppling, the new iconoclasm, for some years. I was covering the 2020 election for British papers, and among other things, ended up in Portland, where I went undercover with Antifa for a few days, and which was interesting, and was there when they pulled down the statue of Abraham Lincoln, which was an extraordinary thing to do, to my mind. I'm not American, but I knew, well, Lincoln is an important figure. I mean, and then when I got to New York and started living there, almost the first thing that happened when I got found was the council chamber voted to remove the statue of Thomas Jefferson, which has sat in the chamber for, well, since the 1830s. And it was winched down and boxed up and wheeled out the back door. And the New York Post, for whom I write a column, was among the newspapers to notice this and to highlight it. And the Post spoke to one of the members of the council who'd voted for this and said, well, Thomas Jefferson doesn't represent our values. Which, again, I mean, as an outsider, I thought that's very strange. But if Thomas Jefferson doesn't represent your values, who does? It seems to me to be a very, very important follow-on question. And I do have the suspicion that if the lady in question had been asked that and been honest, she'd have probably said, well, me, obviously.
Douglas makes a compelling point about modern public figures who avoid defending their claims. The refusal to engage with opposing views creates a one-sided narrative. The iconoclasm, like toppling statues of historical figures such as Abraham Lincoln, further erodes our heritage. We must return to robust public discourse and defend our ideas openly. Does this trend not undermine serious dialogue?
There is a sort of attempt to not only erase the past, but to stand in its place and to say, all these people from the past are found wanting, all of these people from the past are found to have engaged in things we don't like in the present, ergo we are better than the people in the past and we don't need them. There is a list now so long of the figures who've been historically sort of cancelled that I recently started a series called Uncancelled History, you can see online, where I interviewed leading American historians on major figures who have been badly misrepresented in recent years. The one that's been most on my mind this week is Thomas Jefferson. I interviewed the great Jefferson scholar, Jean Yarborough. And it was a terrific session because, of course, she talked about the flaws of Thomas Jefferson, who wants to ignore that, but also the greatness of Jefferson, and also, crucially, the misrepresentation of Jefferson, something I'll come on to. But I submit that a culture which, first of all, allows extraordinary claims to go uncontested, and secondly, is seeing every major figure from the American past pulled down from their plinth, sometimes quite literally, is a culture that's going to be in some serious trouble.
As Douglas rightly says, the erasure of historical figures like Thomas Jefferson is deeply troubling. By cancelling these figures, we lose the valuable lessons they offer, both good and bad. A culture that cancels its history is doomed to lose its identity and values. Is it not arrogant to judge the past by today's standards and assume moral superiority?
Now, I said that I was going to get specific, and let me do so, because I said I want to help to try to find whatever it is that is the opposite of a public intellectual. The person who, as I say, throws out a claim and then doesn't bother to defend it. There are three examples I'll give, three people I'll give as examples, but the first is perhaps my favorite. I discovered while I was speaking yesterday that Robin DiAngelo had spoken at the university last year, and so I was especially interested to know what she said. Robin DiAngelo is the author of a book called White Fragility that was sold by the hundreds of thousands, he says enviously, but it was unbelievable, the piles of this book that were in every bookshop in America. A White Fragility was, I submit, a sort of bomb-throwing exercise by DiAngelo, but one that has had extraordinary consequences on the public discourse in America. She wrote a second book, came out last year, called Nice Racism. It's a very, very bizarre book, which, among other things, makes the claim that there has been no progress in racial relations in America from 1950 until now, which is all the data shows that's flat out wrong. But this is the sort of thing she does. Now, but I wanted to give an example because she very, very, very rarely gives herself up for interview. And she never, ever debates. She will not debate in public, anyone. Countless attempts to try to persuade her to do so, and she just won't do it. And I would give an example of why I think that might be. She did do an interview in 2018 for Christian Amanpour's show. It wasn't actually Amanpour who was interviewing her, it was Michelle Martin, distinguished Black female journalist, who interviewed Robin DiAngelo and was clearly struck by the oddity and extremism of some of DiAngelo's claims. And doing her job as an interviewer, Martin quoted a part of DiAngelo's work where DiAngelo had said that white people find racism, quote, exciting and enjoy, quote, indulging in it. So Martin said to DiAngelo, why do you say that? You're a scholar. Where's your data? What makes you say that? These are all very good questions. This is DiAngelo's answer, quote, there is a kind of glee in the white collective when Black bodies are punished. I'm still getting over what an extraordinary thing that is to say. What a horrible thing it is to say.
Douglas' critique of Robin DiAngelo is spot on. DiAngelo's refusal to debate and engage in public discourse undermines the credibility of her work. Her books, especially White Fragility and Nice Racism, push a narrative that ignores the significant progress made in racial relations. Does this one-sided approach not stifle meaningful dialogue and create unnecessary division in the society?
And and it's just important for everyone who studies rhetoric, the sheer bizarreness of being thrown an extraordinary claim that you have been making in public, being asked for the evidence for it, and in response, making a more extraordinary and impossible to prove claim. But that was Robin DiAngelo. As I say, I submit that she almost certainly doesn't put herself up for public debate because she couldn't survive public debate, because any American could say to her, evidence for my own life, every bit of data that's available. But as I say, the impact of her work has been very considerable. There's two other people I wanted to mention quickly. One is Nicole Hannah-Jones, who weirdly enough started attacking me on social media today. But Nicole Hannah-Jones is the author of the 1619 Project. And I do a critique of that project in this book, partly because I say, again, there are very extraordinary claims being thrown out in this project, which if it hadn't got the imprint of the New York Times, I think wouldn't have got the attention it has now had. The 1619 Project makes repeated assertions which it cannot prove. Let me give a quick example. Hannah-Jones and her colleagues say, well, we have so many historians involved. Actually, a lot of the people they gave the work to were, for instance, sociologists. I apologize if there are any sociologists here. But they give the job of damning capitalism to a sociology professor of very little repute, it has to be said, who writes a chapter in the 1619 Project saying that when an American worker sits down at their office desk today, if you can imagine an American worker going into an office anymore, when an American worker goes into their office and sits down at their computer, they are engaging in a system of recording and and thinking that has a direct link to the plantation system. His evidence for this is a book that he cites that doesn't say what he has just said that it says. And he simply says, well, there was a system of recording, accurate recording on plantations. And that is the sort of thing that's still going on in American offices. Okay. Well, the second bit is true. It's true that systems that are accurate are likely to survive better than ones that are entirely made up. But this claim, of course, entirely ignores, first of all, the fact that the plantation system was obviously a sort of horrible feudal system. And secondly, that the kind of record keeping he's talking about goes back to ancient Babylon. It's an extraordinary claim to make. But as I say, it's become a very normal thing. You want to do over capitalism? You want to say that for the free market system's awful? Best way to do it is to get a sociologist to find a way to say that it's racist, and then job done. And that's a considerable amount of what the 1619 Project has done.
As Douglas rightly points out, D'Angelo's avoidance of public debate and reliance on unprovable claims undermine her credibility. Similarly, the 1619 Project's assertions, often backed by non-historians, lack solid evidence, making it more ideological than factual. This challenges the narratives that rely on sensationalism, rather than substantiated facts. How can we maintain rigorous standards in public debate and historical analysis?
It has thrown out claims, and I repeat, because there's a pattern here, the authors will not debate in public. The originators of the project refuse to debate historians. They occasionally will say, well, I'm not a historian myself, and I don't want to debate with this. The truth is that if you put any of the authors of the 1619 Project up against an American historian, like Gene Yarborough, Alan Gelzer, they wouldn't survive the discussion, because these scholars would say, I'm sorry, what you're saying is just inaccurate, untrue. Let me give a third example, because it's a particularly egregious one, and it has to do with, as I say, Jefferson, who I spent a significant amount of this week thinking about. Ibram X. Kendi wrote another very, very best-selling book a few years ago called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which had enormous impact. Was one of the most widely cited books in people's workplaces when people started passing around, lists of books that you had to read to make yourself a better person. This book almost always featured on such lists alongside D'Angelo's. I read the book because I have this very old-fashioned notion that you should read books if you're going to criticize them. A habit that I can assure you is not ever shared by my critics. But I can tell you also, any writers or would-be writers around here, never pretend you've read a book to the author if you haven't read it. The author knows immediately. I can assure you, when I was on the other side of it, I thought, oh, I'll never do that again. Something in the eyes, very hard to define. But anyway, I actually did read Ibram X. Kendi's book.
Douglas makes another compelling point. The refusal of 1619 Project authors to engage in public debate with historians is telling. It shows an unwillingness to defend their claims against rigorous scrutiny. This avoidance weakens their credibility and suggests their assertions can't withstand factual challenges. Does Douglas' commitment to reading and understanding the works he critiques not exemplify his intellectual ideologies?
He goes on to make the same attack on Thomas Jefferson as he's just done on David Hume. And this is how he does it. He says, I'm quoting Kendi directly, he says, Thomas Jefferson was at fault because, quote, Thomas Jefferson never made the anti-racist declaration. Now, first of all, the anti-racist declaration is a declaration written by Ibram X. Kendi in 2019. It is not Thomas Jefferson's fault that he failed to make the anti-racist declaration demanded of people in 2019 by Ibram X. Kendi. It's a historical fallacy. It's like saying, why are there no cell phones in movies about the 18th century? Well, the iPhone wasn't there then. It's the most basic sort of historical fallacy to fall into. Anyhow, he says Thomas Jefferson never made the anti-racist declaration. And he then goes on to quote Jefferson saying, as an evidence of Jefferson's racism, He quotes Jefferson saying, it would be hazardous to affirm that the racial groups are equal. Now, what he doesn't do, and of course, when I read this, I thought this is such a strange quote. I'll look up where he's got it from. Kennedy's got it from a book about racism and the founding fathers. So first of all, again, he has not been reading through the collected letters of Thomas Jefferson and just stumbled upon it. He is quoting a book about racism. Almost certainly hasn't actually gone and even done the basic thing that the students among you will know you should do, which is you go to the source. You just go to the source. On this occasion, the source is a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Marquis de Chastellux in 1785. The Marquis was a friend of his from France, obviously, and it's a very interesting letter, it turns out, and says exactly the opposite of what Kennedy suggests that the letter says. And I'll quote to you what exactly it is that Jefferson...
Douglas' observation is astute. Holding Thomas Jefferson accountable for not making a modern anti-racist declaration is historically absurd. Jefferson lived in the 18th century, not the 21st. Expecting him to adhere to contemporary standards is intellectually dishonest. Does cherry-picking quotes out of context to label Jefferson as a racist without thorough research not undermine the credibility of such critiques?
Says in this letter, he's musing about an issue, and this is why it's so important to get history right. He's musing about an issue which in his day was unresolved. And for people who are interested in the history of ideas, it's a fascinating one. In Jefferson's day, there was a lively debate among philosophers and others about so-called monogenesis and polygenesis. This was a debate about whether or not the races, which everyone knew by then that there were these different races that existed, of course, they knew that there were different races, but nobody knew if all the races were related or not, or if they had different origins. And this, so the monogenesis argument was actually everyone is from the same origins, and the polygenesis was no, we must be from different origins. Now, the interesting thing about this, by the way, is it's fascinating for people studying, as I say, the way in which people tried to get to truths historically. The polygenesis people had all sorts of troubles on their hands. I mean, among others, if you read some literature on them, they're in such a mess. For instance, they have to work out if there's a white Adam and Eve, it must mean there's a black Adam and Eve, and a Native American Adam and Eve, and a Chinese Adam and Eve, and then that means there's got to be lots of Edens. And how did that work? Why didn't the Bible tell us? They get into a terrible mess over this. Anyhow, the point is that this was an unresolved question. It really wasn't solved until the 19th century. So again, it's not Jefferson's fault that he's still in this position of thinking these things over. But this is what he says to his friend in 1785.
Douglas' critique highlights the intellectual laziness of modern interpretations. The debate over human origins was complex, with thinkers grappling with ideas that were far from settled. Douglas rightly emphasizes the importance of understanding the historical context and resisting the urge to distort past intellectual struggles for contemporary agendas. Is it not ludicrous to judge historical figures by today's standards?
He says, I believe the Indian, which means a Native American, he says, I believe the Indian to be in body and mind equal to the white man. I have supposed the black man in his present state might not be so, but it would be hazardous to affirm that, equally cultivated for a few generations, he would not become so. Now, that's a very interesting passing remark in a letter of Thomas Jefferson's to a friend. He's saying, I don't know, because we don't have the evidence in front of us, but it seems to me that if you give everybody the same opportunities, we come out the same. Now, that seems obvious to us in the 2020s. It was so far from obvious in the 1780s. And I just found it absolutely extraordinary.
As Douglas rightly points out, in 1785, Jefferson acknowledged the potential equality of races given equal opportunities, a radical notion back then. Jefferson's thoughts reflect a genuine understanding of racial equality, proving that our forebears grappled with these issues earnestly, even if their conclusions were not by modern standards. How do we defend the importance of context in historical analysis?
That Kennedy was doing a drive-by shooting on Thomas Jefferson's reputation, using a letter that actually speaks pretty well of Jefferson. But, as I repeat, this seems to me to be a pattern in our time, and one that all of you who are students are going to have to find a way to address. the pattern of people not being willing to contest ideas. And I mention this because it gets to an absolutely central thing of the Western tradition of free thought, free inquiry, and free speech. And that's this. It's that you get all of the ideas out, have them all out, because it's the only way you will get to truth. The only way you can get to truth is if you have all of the ideas out there. The two greatest texts, I think, in the Western canon on free speech, I would say, I'm sort of bored of books about free speech. We've had John Stuart Mill for 2 centuries now. And to my mind, it's almost everything. But Mill and Milton, among others, Milton in the Areopagitico, which is actually about the printing press, about the right to print. He addressed a lot of this in the 17th century. John Stuart Mill in the 19th century addresses the same issues in his wonderful On Liberty, which if any students who are interested in this and haven't read, I much urge you to read, just because apart from anything else, Mill's prose is just beautiful. But Mill lands on what has been, until I think the current age, pretty much agreed upon as the system of free thought, free speech in the West, which is that you have to hear contrary opinions to the ones you hold, and you have to have them out and debate them and much more, for several reasons, but they boil down to these 2 things. The first is that issue that it's the only way to get to truth, because the other person who has an opinion you might not want to hear might be correct. And it is for your own interest the best thing possible that you hear that as soon as possible. And if they're not correct in full, they may be correct in part. But the second defense of Mill's of free speech, in a way, is even more important, which is he says that the person who is wrong must be heard, and that the most harm it can do you is that you will know your own argument better. It's a brilliant piece of prose in which he explains this. He explains how you'll need to test your own knowledge against erroneous opinions every now and then, and you might need them to come along, and that can include horrible opinions, and almost certainly will.
Douglas Murray is spot on in his critique. It's outrageous to see Kennedy attacking Jefferson's reputation using a letter that actually praises Jefferson's forward-thinking views. This trend of dismissing historical figures without engaging with their ideas is a threat to the Western tradition of free thought and speech. How do we champion the importance of open discourse?
The point that is often made on this is, people say, well, there must be some limits. And of course, there are some limits on free speech in every established democracy. And pretty much it's been agreed, again, until the current era, that the limit is incitement. The incitement is the point at which speech becomes violence. But up until that point, everything is allowed. When I was at Oxford, I remember there was, and I was the age of some of you present, there was a pseudo-historian of his day called David Irving, who was a famous Holocaust denier. And he was invited to speak at the Oxford Union. And I remember as a student with my fellow students rowing endlessly about this. I took the position that he shouldn't be allowed to speak. I think now I was wrong, but I think I was 20. What did I know? Anyhow, but the point is I realized I was wrong in retrospect, because actually him going and being faced with historians who countered his points, and the students knowing that such a person was out there with such an argument, made everyone learn more. And that in our own day is going to be a very, very important thing. I mean, for instance, think of the consequence in a society if we weren't very knowledgeable about the Holocaust because we've said these issues are things that you can't discuss. And then somewhere down the line, somebody comes along who's, like Irving almost was, done a lot of work, knows better German than you do, and much more. You would want to be very, very well prepared for such a person, for such a time. And I fear that in so many areas of our lives at the moment, we have made ourselves exceptionally vulnerable to bad ideas, partly because we have stripped away this tradition of doing things, partly because we've stripped away the manner in which we used to debate and discuss ideas and have them out, and partly because there is this great oddity, and I'll finish on this thought, asking Marion to join me, but there's this great oddity in our time that we have to, in a society, in a civilized democracy, you have to have some things you agree on.
Douglas's reflections on free speech are crucial. Limiting speech only to incitement is essential to preserving our democratic values. By allowing even controversial figures like David Irving to speak, we expose and challenge dangerous ideas, strengthening our society's intellectual resilience. We must uphold the tradition of open debate, or to ensure we remain well prepared. Does censorship breed ignorance and vulnerability?
And people speak endlessly, write columns endlessly. People like myself write columns endlessly anyway about things like the division in American life, the left-right divide, the Republican-Democrat divide, and much more. And when people say, you know, how do we fix this divide? I always say, you know, you have to start at the very basics. First of all, try to agree on anything that's just happened, and just find one thing and get everyone to agree it happened and why it happened. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be a disaster like Ohio, or it could be something more benign, but just at least agree that something happened and why it happened. The effects for society when nobody agrees on what just happened are disastrous. So that's my first suggestion always. And the second is this: try to have some unified view of the past, of the American past. I'm so struck in my own lifetime that a story of the American past that used to be passed on from generation to generation hasn't just been revised. All generations revise and revisit, and that's as it should be. I would not ever want that to stop. But that a version of the American past has actually been and is in the process of being erased. And if I look at the figures who I describe in this book, if I look at the people who have been unfairly maligned in recent years, it is hard to find a single figure in American history who stands up to the standards that we are now imposing on the past from 2023. It's an extraordinary act of chutzpah, to say the very least. But as I say, for a society that wishes to have any coherence, it's utterly disastrous. But as I say, all of that starts with the absolute basis of everything, which is the right to air opinions and to argue them out. So anyway, I look forward to doing so with you. Thank you.
Douglas's insights on the American divide are spot on. Preserving an untainted view of American history is vital. Erasing or unfairly maligning historical figures distorts our legacy and weakens our foundations. We must resist the erasure of our past and uphold a unified, respectful narrative to maintain national cohesion. How do we establish a common understanding of events and their impacts?
Listen, you seem to be suggesting that free speech and exercising the muscle of argumentation and debate and rhetoric might be a good way of avoiding violence in society. And certainly our ancestors in this country, the founding generation established a system of government that very much relies on persuasion of our fellow citizens as a way of overcoming disagreements, not coercion. So we should try to continue that. And I always think of Oliver Cromwell's statement that when men run out of words, they pick up swords. So that's one way of seeing speech. But of course, we now have an idea among some folks that speech itself can be an act of violence against someone. And I think we should take it seriously, because if you have someone whose entire identity is wrapped up into a claim that someone else thinks may be baseless, and you attack that argument or that supposition, it can be taken as an existential threat to that person's identity. So how do you guide the person on each side of that conversation?
Well, there is an oddity, isn't there, in our day, which is the two things happening at once. The idea that words can be violence, and the idea that violence cannot be violence, or at least on occasions is not violence. Now, let me take the first one. The words of violence one is such a category error, it's hard to know where to start. It is true that words can wound. I mean, it's one of the delights of them. Kafka says somewhere in a letter to a friend, we should only read books that stab at us. we should only read things that wake us up to such an extent. You know, he wouldn't have got past some censors. But we know that words can wound, and sometimes wound very, very deeply. But to say that they ever approach the same level as physical violence is to tread only into one direction, which is a direction of saying, ergo, we must treat words, if they are badly spoken, with the same seriousness that we treat, say, you punching me right now. And if we do that, we would have to agree societally on what those words were. And I'm not sure that any society could agree on that. Because what wounds one person will not wound another. There are some things that people can say to me which would wound me not at all. Other things that might. Could I legislate on the basis of that? Absolutely not. Would I want to? Absolutely not.
Douglas's stance on free speech as a means to avoid violence is crucial. The notion that words can be violence is a dangerous fallacy. We must uphold the sanctity of free speech, recognizing that violence stems from the suppression of discourse, not from the words themselves. Is the Founding Fathers' reliance on persuasion over coercion a cornerstone of our democracy?
One of the things you always learn about, as a reporter, I've traveled to lots of very unfree countries. And one of the things you discover quite swiftly in any country, like, I don't know, or North Korea is the one that I've been to, which comes most obviously to mind, a kind of extreme example. But what you realize is that in a country where you're allegedly protected by speech laws, you can't say anything. You're simply not free in any meaningful way. A society in which even your deepest feelings can be trodden upon is absolutely the only society worth living in. All other options are totalitarian to some degree or other and have to be resisted, in my view.
Douglas' experiences in unfree countries like North Korea highlight the stark contrast between true freedom and oppressive regimes. Upholding free speech, even when it challenges our deepest feelings, is essential to resist totalitarianism. Douglas's insights remind us that protecting free speech is paramount to preserving our liberty and democracy. Is genuine freedom non-existent in societies where speech is stifled?
So here. So if I could ask you before you make your statement or ask your question, if you could just identify yourself, please go ahead.
I've been listening to your book, and it's a wonder to me that recent developments in our thought, which are ironically born out of our Western mindset, are themselves self-loathing of the West, which is like we've created our own destructive potential. Are there cultures that have done that, have created their own demise, and were they able to avoid it?
Well, it's a very good question. You probably know the famous Toynbee quote that the civilizations don't die, they commit suicide. It's a pretty, I mean, it's hard to think of a case of a civilization that's died where that hasn't been the case. I think, I mean, one of the interesting aspects of what you say is the issue of what I regard as being where self-criticism goes wrong. I regard self-criticism as being an incredibly important thing in a society. Like, you do not want to be living in a society that is not self-critical, any more than you would want to live with somebody who is not self-critical. The question for society as with an individual is, where does self-criticism become a kind of self-harm or a self-laceration or even a self-destruction? I think actually it's not that hard to identify.
Douglas' point about self-criticism turning into self-destruction is crucial. It's clear that Western societies, in their quest for self-improvement, have become overly self-critical, leading to a form of cultural suicide. To preserve our society, we must balance healthy self-criticism with pride in our heritage and achievements, avoiding the pitfalls of self-destruction. Does this self-loathing not undermine our values and achievements?
And my best attempt to identify it is this. Everyone in this room at some point has been given advice, I hope you all have, But you've been given advice in your life by a variety of people, I would assume. We can all tell, we develop in order to tell pretty easily the difference between somebody who is giving us advice who wishes us well and somebody giving us advice who wishes us ill. So if my mother said to me, Douglas, I think you've done this wrong, or you shouldn't have worn that, or I don't know. But I'd listen, at least. I might not agree, but I would listen because I would know that she wished me well. If a stranger came over to me in the street and said, I hate your face, your voice, you can't write, you can't speak, your clothes are awful, and there's this thing I think you should do, I wouldn't follow that guy's advice because I knew he didn't have my best interests at heart. Now, I submit it's the same with societies. I think that if somebody says, now, look, this is an amazing country, has a huge amount going for it, a huge amount of opportunity, it had a remarkable past, but there are things that we should address in it. I would say absolutely. If said, and there are things in the present we need to address. So there are inequalities going on at the moment. I'd say absolutely. Let's discuss them. Let's discuss the way to solve them. If somebody said everything in this country's past is rotten, we've been rotten from the start, and we've never done any good, I don't think that person is speaking as a critic who wants to improve the society. I think they're speaking of the society as though an enemy. And I cannot understand why people would listen to such a person. I hope that answers some of your question.
As Douglas rightly says, it's vital to recognize the difference between constructive and destructive criticism. Societies should heed advice from those who genuinely wish them well, much like individuals trust advice from loved ones. Overemphasis on negative, ill-intentioned critiques can lead to societal self-destruction. How do we focus on acknowledging our strengths while addressing issues constructively?
Serendipitously enough, my name is also Elijah Parrish. I'm a sophomore studying philosophy and psychology. You gave this very nice discussion of the transition from public intellectuals to scare quotes, public intellectuals. And I want to ask if you could provide maybe a genealogy of what's changed. So perhaps some like sub questions of this would be like, who can get away with not defending your claims? You appear to need to defend your claims, whereas some people you've mentioned don't have to defend your claims. What do those people have in common? Why them in particular? What has changed, and why has it changed?
That's a very good question. It's a very tough one because I think everyone probably present has their own sort of mental history of where things changed on this. My own view is that, I mean, people who will not contest their ideas in public, it tends to be that they know that they're not good enough to do it. Now, you could say sometimes that, I mean, I do know people who are, like, for instance, distinguished scholars, but aren't very dexterous on their feet on a public debate and wouldn't love to do it, but, you know, might. If any of you who study the Middle East will know distinguished Middle Eastern scholar Edward Said, and probably also know of one of his great enemies from the academy. There's a video online of Bernard Lewis and Edward Said debating in New York in the 1980s, and you can tell Lewis is hating every single moment of it. His throat is drying up, his sort of glottal problems, his eyes are bulging. Because Edward Said was a wonderful debater, and I think Christopher Hitchens was also on Edward Said's side, so it was sort of rough going. But my point is you could see the physical discomfort, but still, Bernard Lewis knew since he had written against Said and Said had written against him, you couldn't duck doing it in public at some point, and so they do. I would say it's sometime after the internet, after social.
Douglas astutely highlights the decline in rigorous public intellectual discourse. Those who avoid defending their claims often lack the robustness of thought necessary for public debate. The erosion of rigorous debate standards is a significant concern, as it weakens the fabric of informed public discourse. Does this trend not foster a culture where weak ideas go unchallenged?
Media I think the technical reason it's happened is that people are able to avoid people who do not agree with them in the same way that a user can. So people speak to an audience base. And if you say you really have to be able to argue that in public, they effectively don't need to, because they've got whatever financial system it is in place that allows them to only speak to a group of people who agree with them and who will egg them on and urge them on and encourage them and so on. But I do think that's cowardly. I think it's fundamentally cowardly and it should be called out as such. And part of the reason it isn't, I think, is also that people are intimidated by the claims that will be made. You know, if you notice the claims of excommunication in our era, they are all the ones that are most damaging. And they're ones that most ordinary people would want to avoid having leveled at them. So they just duck. But you can get an awfully long way if you're a bully. I have to say that is one of the things you learn in life. I mean, you can get an awfully long way if you're willing, for instance, to throw out malicious claims about people. And I wish it wasn't the case. I wish more people stood up to bullies. But we do have a sort of bullying thing in the public square in America in particular, where people say things and effectively say, you want to criticize that? Be my guest and wait to hear what I call you. I don't think it's a civilized way to go about debate, but anyhow. Yeah, of course.
Douglas' observation about the impact of social media on public discourse is spot on. The ability to avoid dissenting opinions fosters intellectual cowardice and weakens debate. It's crucial to challenge this trend and call out those who avoid defending their views publicly. Does that practice not just erode the foundation of informed debate and promote a culture of intellectual laziness?
So you gave this very nice reconstruction of Mill's argument. So there are two cases of ideas. Some are bad ideas. When you hear bad ideas, you can strengthen your own position. And when you hear good ideas, the good ideas will win out over the bad ideas. And it seems like a hidden presupposition, a hidden assumption in this argument is that good ideas win out over time. However, it seems like your whole talk was a discussion of how the good ideas are losing. And so I suppose my question is, why should we maintain this faith that good ideas will win out? And perhaps better yet, is there any reason to undermine this faith that good ideas will win out?
Oh, I mean, faith gets undermined all the time, like all forms of faith. My own view is simply that in the long run, the good ideas win out. But the short run could be quite long. I mean, for instance, what I'm describing, I'm fairly confident that America will get back to a story of itself that is reasonable. You know, and I'm confident about that because I think that in general, people want to have pride in things, and that's a necessary and legitimate thing. All peoples want to have pride in their country, and quite rightly so. And that Americans should have that right as much as anyone else in the world. So I'm fairly confident, actually, that the current sort of iconoclastic moment will pass. But it won't pass inevitably. It will pass by people challenging it at every dinner table, at every bar, and much more, and knowing more. And I think that that's going to be an absolutely crucial thing, that Americans are involved in the debate about themselves and their past. But yes, in the short term, we were talking about this yesterday, in the short term, think of the devastating possibility that social media has for passing a lie around. You know, the famous Mark Twain quote about the lie going around the world before the truth has got its boots on. In the world of the internet, you know, if a significant person with significant following spun a lie tomorrow, that lie could go on it could go very far, very fast, and it would take a long time to pick it apart. But I think it could still be picked apart. It's better than the alternatives.
Douglas's insights are profoundly accurate. People now avoid engaging with opposing views, creating an environment that stifles robust debate. We must challenge this intellectual laziness and encourage public discourse that demands accountability, ensuring that strong, well-defended ideas prevail. Is this trend not detrimental to our society, as it allows weak ideas to flourish unchecked?
I'm Connor Fraley. I'm at the law school here at UNC. I think I speak for maybe a lot of people at the school that we're quite thankful one, that you're here, but two, also that Nicole Hannah-Jones declined a tenured position here because they hadn't initially offered her tenure. So we have not been inflicted by her.
Oh, that's right. I've forgotten that was here.
Yeah,
Oh,
that was here. So I think
I
I
will
speak for a
send
lot.
a photo of me.
Oh my
here.
goodness, yeah. So that's a good thing. My question for you is like when you're talking about Europe, about the feeling there that the stories run out. How different do you think that is here? Obviously, we don't have the old aristocracy, the old money, the long histories here. Yet we seem to have this kind of cultural suicide kind of thing going. How different is Europe from here in terms of that feeling of cultural fatigue?
Yeah, I wrote about that in Strange Death of Europe. There's a word in German, which I don't know how many German speakers we might have here, but the German language is wonderful, as you know, for having words that English needs sentences for. And one of my favorites is a German word that translates into English as tiredness with history. It's a very, very telling thing that the German language would need this word. Tired, that history is tiring. It's an exhausting burden. Now, of course, as I say in The Strange Death of Europe, it's not a surprise that Germany would have such a feeling. I mean, Germany is still living in the period where the world is still trying to work out what happened in the 20th century. I mean, we're looking at, think that one of the interesting things, just to bear with me on this, but one of the amazing things about talking about Germans, about their own philosophy, for instance, is that you discover that they're still picking that apart like a crime scene. Certain philosophers are, they worry about. The most obvious one is Nietzsche. Whenever a student says to me, I like Nietzsche, I always say, well, you've got to be specific. Which bits? This precision on this is going to matter. And I use Nietzsche a bit in The War on the West, and I always say very carefully, because he's an extraordinary and important thinker. But people also read Nietzsche and have terrible ideas. And yes, he was an extraordinary figure. But as I say, imagine living in a culture where you actually had the kind of level of suspicion that is now going on about the American past, but it was totally justified because you had the biggest catastrophe in history in living memory, and were still trying to work out why it happened. That would weigh on you, and it weighs on Germany, and Germany being the most important power in Europe means that it weighs on Europe.
The cultural fatigue Douglas describes is evident in both Europe and America. The absence of figures like Nicole Hannah-Jones in academia is a relief, as it prevents the spread of divisive ideologies. Instead, we must focus on preserving and celebrating our historical narratives to maintain national pride and unity. Is this weariness with our rich histories not alarming?
I've always hoped that America was different, and I think it is. I think it remains different. I hope that it remains different. The explanation for much of the ideological craziness of recent years has been that French theory, with a capital T, was sent to America. America spun it through America's racial identity politics and then sent it hurtling back at France, which said, we don't want this. But that's the intellectual movement of recent decades. A pretty fascinating thing to see. By the way, that's an interesting phenomenon. The French saying, that Macron himself said in 2020, not one statue or memorial will come down in France. We need all of our history. We need all of it. Very interesting. And he's not a right-wing maniac. Not by a long way.
Douglas' observation about America adopting and amplifying French theory, only for France to reject it, underscores the importance of preserving our history. Macron's stance on maintaining statues and memorials, despite not being a right-wing figure, is a testament to the value of remembering our past. How do we champion this approach to safeguard our cultural heritage against ideological extremism?
I'm Casey Fraley. I'm Connor Fraley's wife.
Oh.
So my question, when you're talking about like the faux public intellectual, I was reminded of Shelby Steele's White Guilt. And he talks about storming into the dean's office and he's ashing his cigarette on the carpet with all these demands with all the other Black students. And that this was like a new thing that we could go and make these demands to people in power. And I was wondering if you think, like, is this the origin of this feeling, like the foothold that we can't argue with these people because they have there's some truth to the morality of their position. And so we don't want to argue with them. And then has that just snowballed from that point to where you can't argue about gender or COVID or whatever it is? Is that the beginning?
Well, I mean, essentially, there's lots of problems in there. Have you ever seen the tape of Evergreen, the meltdown at Evergreen College? Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has seen this, but it's quite remarkable. Some of the students in 2017, I wrote about it in The Madness of Crowds, stormed in because Brett Weinstein, the biologist, had done something that was completely innocuous, but which was presented by some students as being absolutely terrible and racist and so on. And they ended up in the dean's office, and the dean is like this cringing figure who at one point asks permission to go to the bathroom, and they deny him permission. It is, and one of them says, tie a knot in it or something. And eventually they allow him to go under escort. I mean, you watch this and you just cannot believe. I mean, you want to say this, Dean, effectively. I mean, how do you sleep at night after that embarrassment, after not standing up, and after being so pathetic? Are you not embarrassed by yourself? I think he is now, but that was an example of a very significant factor in our society at the moment, which is older people being scared of the young. And that is a very modern thing. Old people did not used to be scared of young people. It was the other way around, in quite recent memory as well. And, I think that we just need to have a better understanding and I mean, think of the way in which our culture talks about old people.
Douglas's commentary on the ideological chaos at Evergreen College is spot on. The incident with Brett Weinstein exemplifies how extreme leftist ideologies have infiltrated academic institutions. This phenomenon, rooted in a misguided sense of moral superiority, has stifled open debate and critical thinking. How do we push back against this trend and defend the principles of free speech?
Think of the way in which a phrase like dead white men has been turned into this horrible commonplace phrase that we've allowed sort of deeply disrespectful things that dismiss everything from the past. As I always say, the dead white men thing, people who say it use white as an insult, use male as an insult, and they use dead as an insult, as if that was a stupid thing for them to do. Who would die? Well, total losers. On top of everything else, But if you think of the way in which we've allowed phrases like this and assumptions like this to just wash past us all, it's horrific when you think about it.
Douglas's observation about the phrase dead white men highlights a disturbing trend in our culture. This extreme leftist rhetoric aims to erase the contributions of those who shaped our society. We must stand firm against this cultural degradation and honor the legacy of our forebears. Does the casual dismissal of historical figures not undermine the foundations of our civilization?
Hi, I'm Leanna. I'm a law student here at UNC. And a part in your talk that reminded me of an experience I had recently, the part where you said, you were talking about how authors very often take quotes and misconstrue them in a way to dismiss the person as a whole. I was in an interview recently where I mentioned in passing that I had listened to an audiobook about Winston Churchill. And the person interviewing me asked me whether I had a positive or negative reaction to him. And I kind of, said some of the things that made me have a positive reaction to him. And he followed up with asking whether I had considered in my positive attitude toward Winston Churchill about how he had done all these terrible things in Africa and Burma, and whether that changes my opinion at all. And I was wondering what you would say, like if you read it in a paper or in a book, that's one reaction you can have. But if you're confronted with it in a professional setting or in a more intellectual setting, how do you react to that kind of criticism?
It's horrible. It's a terrifying example. As I always say, Dante got it wrong. There's always another circle. I mean, you know, one problem from this is that, you know, you were listening to a book. If somebody says, have you considered all of these other ideas? You know, you might do with some people, but nobody can do with everyone. Like, we can't all become experts in everything. I mean, it's an expectation in the internet age that we are, you know, you're an expert in ivermectin and also lockdowns and also COVID and also history and all biology and everything. It's too much. None of us can really do this. The best shorthand way to do it, without getting specific, although I will come back to the specifics on Churchill, the best shorthand way to do it is to say, can we not look at people in the round? I mean, you know, one need not have a hagiographic attitude towards somebody, nor a totally dismissive attitude towards somebody.
Douglas's point about the distortion of historical figures is crucial. The unfair vilification of icons like Winston Churchill for their perceived faults, without acknowledging their monumental contributions. This extreme leftist approach to history aims to rewrite our past. How do we defend the integrity of our historical figures and resist the urge to judge them by today's standards?
Being kindly to figures in the past and trying to understand them is necessary, among other things, because it's a preemptive request to the people who come after us to be kind to us in turn. We would want our successors to try to understand us. I mean, I have an editor, for instance, The Spectator in London, who always says to me that, well, he doesn't always say it to me, he said it to me, that every single era in history does stuff that we think is insane, and we just don't know why they do it. What were they thinking of? Like, what were the Spartans thinking of when they did this? What were the Victorians thinking of when they were shoving children up chimneys? What on earth? Don't they realize you're not meant to shove children up chimneys? You don't do that anymore. Now we look at that and we think, why didn't they know that? My friend and editor's point is, he says, work out, assume, since that's been the case with every civilization and every era in history, assume we are doing things now that our successors will look at with bafflement and say they were doing what in the 21st century, and try to work out what those things are now. And this is a very interesting challenge, actually, and it's one of the reasons why anyone here who's a writer or wants to be a writer, there's a lot to do.
Douglas's insight into understanding historical figures is vital. By attempting to understand the context of their actions, we set a precedent for future generations to judge us fairly. Every era has practices that seem baffling in hindsight, and it's crucial to recognize that our time will be no different. How do we advocate for a balanced view of history?
But on the specific of Churchill, by the way, it's a very interesting one. He's an example, like Jefferson, of somebody whose reputation has turned in a very short time span. There are a set of allegations against Winston Churchill which do the rounds now. Some of them are true. He said some things that undoubtedly by modern standards we would regard as racist. He had Victorian attitudes about a whole range of things because he was born in the Victorian era. I mean, if he had Victorian attitudes and he was born in, 2010, we might think it odd, but he was born at the height of Victorian England. And but the specifics of the ones, as well as there being things that are said about Churchill that are true, there are criticisms made of him now that are wildly untrue. For instance, it's claimed that he was responsible for the Bengal famine in 1943, the terrible, terrible famine. He had no responsibility, obviously, for the cyclone that caused the famine, and did everything he could at the height of the war to get grain to Bengal from Australia. Thousands of people died, but it was not Winston Churchill's fault that they died. But here's the bigger thing in a way, which is, even if they had, even if Churchill didn't do enough to avoid the famine in 1943, when Japanese and German U-boats were patrolling the oceans, it should count as something in a man's favor if he does more than any other human being to destroy fascism. It should be on the positive side of the ledger. And, you know, I mean, anyone who knows their mid-20th century history knows, and anyone who knows their British history knows, it was not inevitable that Britain was going to go the way that Churchill wanted it to go in the 1930s. Very strong opinion at a very high level that wanted appeasement. If Britain had gone with appeasement or had been invaded, there is almost no doubt that everything in the 20th century and indeed the 21st century would be utterly different. If Britain had not held out in the crucial year of 1940, principally because of Winston Churchill, Britain would almost certainly have fallen to Nazism or had to do a deal with fascism, and the whole continent would have gone fascist. And America, if it hadn't have ended, I mean, America didn't want to enter the war at that point. So I'm amazed, as I say, that when you weigh these things up, I want to say to some of these people, like, who do you think you are? I mean, and
as Douglas rightly says, we must emphasize the importance of context when evaluating historical figures. Churchill, born in the Victorian era, naturally held some views that seem outdated today. However, his monumental role in defeating fascism during World War II far outweighs any controversial statements. How do we honor his legacy and resist the leftist attempts to tarnish his reputation?
And I suppose just one other thought on that, you know, because I was interviewing Andrew Roberts, who was Winston Churchill's best living biographer. I was interviewing him recently for this series, and I realized something from the discussion that hadn't really come to me before, which was this. One of the fascinating things about taking down really great people, really great men and women, people like Churchill, I would say like Lincoln, like Jefferson. One of the problems is it demotivates your society. And what I mean by that is, if you recognize that individuals being courageous changes the course of human history, then you not only have something to admire, but something to aspire to in your life. It says you also could have a great contribution to give to the world, to your country, to your nation. You too can write your name in the book of history. Now that's an inspiring thing, and it has fueled people for generations. But if you say even Churchill is to count for nothing, then what is the point of any human endeavor? Nothing could ever be good enough in that case. No one could be pure enough. In which case, what's the point of getting out of bed in the morning? I'm serious. I think that this has a highly demotivating effect on a society, which is why it has to be tackled. Lenin. I will take it as a cynical comment. If I've read you correctly.
Final two questions.
Okay.
Douglas Murray's insight is crucial. We must defend the legacy of great figures like Churchill, Lincoln, and Jefferson. Their achievements inspire future generations to strive for greatness. Dismissing their contributions demoralizes society and undermines the potential for individual excellence. How do we resist the cynical attempts to erase their legacy and ensure their inspiring stories continue to motivate us all?
Hi, my name is Colby McQuaid. I'm also from the law school. And you talked about people giving bad advice and what their true intentions are. And today it feels that those who kind of demonize America's history and don't want to help, they kind of want to tear it down. And that being said, we all know that we're in a culture war, and it feels like they're playing a game of if I can't have it, no one can. And further, I'd argue that the culture is controlled by the other side. We're losing right now. So when does it approach a point where we also start to think maybe we should tear it down? Maybe we need to restart. So like, how do we avoid a true culture war?
Well, it's a very good question. As I say, it's sort of slightly return to what I said in my main remarks, which is I do think it's just absolutely crucial to agree on some things. I mean, I'm very, very concerned about this country's attitude towards elections. There's no other developed democracy in which people don't agree who won the election. And I mean, none. There is no movement in Britain that thinks that Labour Party won the 2019 election. No. Now, if you cannot even agree on elections, you know, I just can't understand why there isn't some cross-partisan effort just to like work out how to do it better and cleaner and whatever, and just agree on it. Say, look, just for the health of the republic, it's just deeply desirable that at least this. And the reason why is because if the person who wins needs to know they've won, but it's really important that when somebody loses, they know they've lost, because then you can correct, you can change, you can adapt, you can think about what you got wrong and why you were rejected. So losing is an incredibly important thing to do, as is winning. But I do worry about where this country is going on that. I always urge against the burn it down, but I do think that the most important positive thing people can do is to build it up. I mean, you know, you always in America have had, much more so than in Britain or Europe, you have always had this ability and this tradition to start things anew, to start new institutions. I mean, what are all these glorious universities and campuses, but the visions of small numbers of people, sometimes one person, to start something small that sometimes, of course, grows gargantuan and has millions of HR people and all sorts of other things, but not necessarily in the vision of the founders. But I digress. In general, that is the story of America. It is of people founding things, and if you don't like the ones that are there, doing it anew. And I'm confident in this. I mean, even with the universities in this country, you know, some people say, you know, they don't like this university, they don't like this system, they think this is rotten. What happens in America? People will start new universities, and they already are, you know?
Douglas brilliantly emphasizes the need for unity on core democratic principles. Without this agreement, we risk tearing down the very fabric of our society. Instead of succumbing to the divisive tactics of those who demonize our history, we should focus on preserving and improving our institutions. How do we ensure a stable and prosperous future for our nation?
Hello, my name is Simone Lonsane. I'm a freshman at UNC, which is a word that has now been deemed sexist, so we've replaced it with first year. I'm studying biology and public policy. And my question for you is, recently we've seen a drastic increase in social media posts and accounts being fact-checked and taken down for information that is deemed false. What role, if any, do you believe the media has in providing factual information to the public? Additionally, what is more important on social media platforms, the freedom to express a dangerous opinion or the preservation of safety and decorum on a public platform?
That's a good and very pertinent question. I spent a certain amount of time the last year concentrating on Twitter because I've had the opportunity to see some of the back workings of what's been going on. I was with the CEO of Twitter, Parag, on the day that Elon Musk pulled out of the deal, and subsequently saw what came out in the Twitter files. And I'm confident that under different leadership, in any case, everybody is still wrestling with exactly the question that you raise. My view is that there's only two ways you can go with social media moderation, as with any other form of publishing. Effectively, you come back to the argument of Milton on publishing in the 17th century, which is you either allow for, as it were, dangerous opinion, or you decide to restrict opinion. And that's, broadly speaking, those are the only two options you have in front of you. Now, if you decide to restrict opinion, you have to come up with a very wise council of men and women and others who will guide the human species accurately through all the storms that come. Now, I don't know if you know anyone good enough for that role, but I don't. I mean, I have jokingly said to people at Twitter, I wouldn't trust myself to be a content safety moderator. I wouldn't trust myself, let alone a 22-year-old virgin in Silicon Valley. I don't see who could ever have the power that these people have wielded. And wielded secretly. That's one of the worst things with Twitter in particular, you know, not telling people we have these tricks we can do behind the scenes. So my own view is that between these two things, looking for the incredibly holy, brilliant group that will magisterially solve all problems and tell us what is true, or noisy, messy, dirty at times, but that's the deal. That's the bar you walked into. I'd rather have the second, every time.
Douglas rightly points out the importance of unity on core democratic principles, such as accepting election outcomes. By focusing on preserving our institutions and improving them, we can ensure a prosperous future. It's imperative that we resist the tactics of those who seek to undermine our history and values. How do we maintain the stability and integrity of our nation?
And, you know, if I want decorum, I don't go to Twitter. If I want decency, I don't go to Twitter. But we're adults. We're not children. One of the fundamental problems of the age is the infantilization of adults, as if we are children. Children, it's a totally different thing. But once you're an adult, you have to be able to put up with things. You have to not be fragile, and you have to be able to choose where you go in your life. And if you want to go to a raucous party, virtually or actually, go to the raucous party. And if you want a decorous tea party, go to a decorous tea party. And everyone can have their own fun. But as I say, of the two options, that's the only one, it seems to me, at all viable. But thank you. It's a very important question.
That's a great one to end on, Douglas, as we head off on a Thursday night. Thank you for coming. If you have lucky number 1 through 7, you get a free autographed book over here. So come down and pick that up. Thank you for coming. I can say this about Chapel Hill in the springtime. Anybody with gray hair will tell you it doesn't get any better than this. So enjoy it while you've got it. Thank you for coming. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Douglas makes an important point in his closing remarks. Rejecting the infantilization of society and embracing the notion that adults should navigate their own paths, whether they seek spirited debate or refined conversations. Twitter may not be the place for decorum, but it's essential that we uphold the values of strength. How do we recognize the importance of personal responsibility? Douglas made some compelling arguments about free speech, among other key topics. But what are your thoughts on what Douglas had to say? Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking content.